The story begins with the chilling image of Maya, a disabled young girl, lying motionless in the snow on a freezing night. Her mother, Rachel, watches in horror from a distance as Clara Sullivan, the woman from the HOA, raises a gun and shoots Maya. The echo of the gunshot pierces the night air, the impact of the bullet leaving Maya crumpled on the cold ground, fighting for her life. Rachel, paralyzed by shock and helplessness, sprints toward her daughter, but the freezing temperatures and Maya's desperate struggle against the cold make it nearly impossible to save her in time. With every step Rachel takes, her heart sinks, realizing how dire the situation is. Maya, barely conscious, starts to fade in and out of awareness as Rachel finally reaches her, trying to keep her warm, but it's clear that the odds are stacked against them. Maya's breathing becomes slower, weaker, and the snow starts to settle around them, thickening into a barrier between life and death. The horror intensifies as Clara coldly walks away from the scene, leaving Maya to bleed and freeze to death. But just when it seems all hope is lost, a shocking discovery hours later forces Rachel to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about Clara Sullivan, setting the stage for a relentless pursuit of justice. Maya Thompson was more than just a disabled child, she was a beacon of light in a world that often tried to dim her shine. Despite the challenges that came with her cerebral palsy, Maya found joy in the smallest things, like the fluttering of snowflakes in the winter or the warmth of her mother's embrace. She wasn't defined by her disability, rather, she was defined by her courage, her laughter, and her resilience. Maya had a spirit that refused to be broken, no matter how many obstacles life placed in her way. The snowflakes that danced around her in the wintertime became symbols of the beauty she saw in the world, even when others might have seen only the struggle. Rachel Thompson, Maya's mother, was her unwavering protector. From the moment Maya was born, Rachel's life revolved around ensuring her daughter had every chance to experience the world with love and hope, despite her limitations. Rachel had never known a life where the burden of worry wasn't present, but she carried it with grace and an unyielding determination to shield Maya from harm. Raising a disabled child in a world that wasn't built for her wasn't easy, but Rachel didn't let that stop her. Her days were filled with doctor visits, therapy sessions, and endless care, but every moment spent with Maya was a reminder of why she fought so hard. Her love for Maya was her greatest strength, and she would do anything to keep her safe. Clara Sullivan was a name Rachel had come to dread. As a longtime member of the HOA, Clara presented herself as an upstanding and respectable woman, often pushing her authority to impose unreasonable demands on her neighbors, including Rachel. What began with trivial complaints, minor issues about lawn care, parking, and noise, soon escalated into something much darker. Clara's behavior towards Maya was always peculiar, crossing lines that no one dared to question. She would stare at Maya for longer than necessary, her icy gaze making Rachel uncomfortable. Her outwardly sweet smile often hit a sharper, more malicious tone whenever she spoke to Maya. No one knew just how deep the darkness ran beneath Clara's polite veneer, and no one suspected the danger that lurked behind the woman who appeared to be nothing more than an overbearing HOA member. But Rachel could feel it, the unsettling tension every time Clara was near. Little did they know, Clara's intentions were far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The night was unusually cold, with snowflakes drifting down in a soft, relentless cascade. Rachel had just tucked Maya into her warm bed, the faint hum of the heater filling the silence. She glanced out the window, watching as the blanket of snow began to thicken, turning the neighborhood into a quiet, winter wonderland. But that peace would be shattered when a loud knock echoed through the house. Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat. Who could be at the door this late? She walked to the front door, half expecting it to be one of the neighbors seeking help or asking about the weather. But when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the doorstep was Clara Sullivan, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and something darker. "Clara?" Rachel said, her voice a bit shaky. "What's going on?" "It's late, and it's freezing out here." Clara's gaze was cold, her eyes narrowed into sharp slits. "You know what you're doing, Rachel," she spat, her voice laced with an intensity Rachel had never heard before. "You're breaking the rules, and I've had enough of it. Your daughter's disruptions need to end, tonight." Clara stepped forward, her tone becoming more menacing as she continued, "You're making everyone else suffer, and I won't allow it any longer." Rachel's heart raced. "Clara, you're overreacting. It's just a few noises from Maya." "She's not hurting anyone," Rachel pleaded, trying to defuse the tension. She stepped out onto the porch, shivering in the cold air, but Clara remained unmoved, her presence only growing more imposing. "I've tried being patient, but no more." "You've crossed the line," Clara said, her voice rising with every word. Rachel's eyes scanned Clara's hands, noting how tightly they gripped a large object hidden beneath her coat. The icy stare Clara shot her made Rachel's stomach twist with unease, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Without warning, Clara pulled out a gun, the cold steel gleaming under the faint light of the street lamp. Rachel's blood ran cold. "Clara, no!" Rachel screamed, stepping forward instinctively, her voice shaking in terror. "What are you doing?" Clara didn't answer. Instead, she aimed the gun directly at Maya, who was still inside the house, unaware of the impending danger. Rachel's heart stopped as Clara pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot ripped through the night, louder than anything Rachel had ever heard, and the sharp crack echoed through the streets, breaking the peaceful silence of the snow-covered neighborhood. Maya screamed in agony from inside, the terrifying sound of her pain cutting straight through Rachel's soul. Panic surged within her as she rushed toward the door, but Clara, unflinching, stood in the way, blocking her path. "No!" Rachel screamed again, her voice hoarse. She shoved Clara aside with all the force she could muster, but Clara merely smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a chill through Rachel's spine. Clara turned and walked away, her heels crunching in the snow, each step deliberate and full of finality. Rachel dashed inside, her eyes locking onto Maya, who was lying on the floor, struggling for breath, her body weak from the injury. "Maya!" Rachel cried, rushing to her daughter's side, but the bleeding was heavy, and Maya's breath was slow and labored. Rachel's mind raced, trying to process the horror of the moment, but all she could think was that Clara had left her daughter to die, left her to freeze in the merciless cold. Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she cradled Maya, her desperate cries for help going unanswered by the empty streets outside. There was no one to stop the nightmare that Clara had begun, and Rachel was left with nothing but fear and heartbreak as her daughter fought for her life. The moment the gunshot rang out, everything seemed to freeze. Rachel's heart stopped as the sharp crack echoed through the cold, snowy night. It was as if time had paused, the air thick with tension and disbelief. The sound of Maya's scream pierced the stillness, a horrifying cry that shattered Rachel's resolve. She turned frantically, her heart racing, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She bolted toward the house, desperate to get to her daughter, but before she could even reach the door, the horror of the moment began to sink in. Maya had been shot, her innocent, defenseless body now crumpled on the floor, blood seeping from the wound, staining the snow a dark red. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears as she rushed inside, the world narrowing to the sight of her daughter lying motionless in a pool of blood. Maya's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, and her breath was shallow, each gasp a struggle. Rachel's heart wrenched as she knelt beside her, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the damage. "Maya, baby, stay with me," Rachel cried, her voice breaking as she cradled her daughter's head in her lap, trying to stop the bleeding. But it was no use. The blood kept flowing, thick and fast, and with each passing second, Rachel could feel the weight of the situation crushing down on her. She had to act fast, but the injury was so severe, Maya's body too frail to withstand the damage. Outside, Clara stood still, her back to Rachel as she made no move to help, no sign of regret or remorse. Her cold, detached demeanor sent a wave of fury through Rachel, but she couldn't focus on Clara. All that mattered now was Maya. Every second felt like an eternity as Rachel's eyes locked onto her daughter's fading form. Maya's eyes fluttered, but she couldn't speak. Her body was too weak, her muscles unable to move as the freezing cold seeped into her bones, intensifying the pain of the gunshot wound. She tried to crawl, to inch her way toward safety, but her body was simply not strong enough. Her legs trembled, unable to support her, and she collapsed back onto the ground, a pained gasp escaping her lips. "Maya! Don't give up. Please don't give up," Rachel pleaded, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hand against the wound, trying desperately to stop the blood flow. But there was so much blood, and Maya's body seemed to be slipping further and further from her grasp. Rachel's own strength faltered, and she felt helpless, powerless, but she couldn't let her daughter die in front of her. She had to save her. Rachel's heart shattered as she watched Maya's body shudder with each labored breath, the cold beginning to numb her skin. Maya's body was fighting against her, her spirit refusing to give in, but how long could she hold on? The freezing night air, the blood loss, the pain, it was too much for a child to endure. Rachel sobbed, clutching Maya tighter, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She screamed for help, her voice hoarse with desperation, but the quiet, empty neighborhood seemed to mock her. No one came. Clara remained just outside, a figure of icy indifference. Rachel could see her faint outline, standing in the snow, her shoulders rigid, her face expressionless. She didn't flinch, didn't turn around to look at the devastation she had caused. Her cold, callous nature sent a shiver down Rachel's spine, but she couldn't afford to focus on Clara now. She couldn't. In that moment, Rachel felt a surge of helplessness wash over her. The woman who had terrorized their lives, who had shot her daughter without a second thought, was walking away without even a glance back. Clara had no remorse, no shame. She had made her decision to end Maya's life and was walking away without so much as a flicker of guilt. Rachel could feel the weight of that cruelty, that cold detachment, crushing her. Clara was leaving Maya to die, and there was nothing Rachel could do to stop her. "Maya, please don't leave me," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible as she rocked back and forth, holding her daughter tightly. Maya's breathing was growing slower, weaker. But even as her body failed her, Maya's eyes flickered up to her mother's face, her gaze filled with a quiet resolve, as though trying to reassure Rachel that she wasn't giving up. Rachel pressed her forehead to Maya's, her tears falling freely as she whispered words of love, of hope, even as she felt the world slipping away. Maya's chest heaved one last time, her breath shaky, but then, in that fragile moment, Rachel thought she could feel her daughter's spirit fighting back, pushing against the darkness that was threatening to take her. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Rachel wouldn't let it be. She would fight for her daughter with every ounce of strength she had left, and she would make sure that Clara Sullivan faced the consequences of her actions. The pain was unbearable, but Rachel refused to let go. She could feel Maya's pulse growing faint, but she kept holding her, fighting against the cold, against the fear, against the inevitable. It was a battle neither of them could afford to lose. And Rachel knew that whatever happened next, she would make sure that Clara would pay for what she had done. The chaos that followed was like a blur, a whirlwind of panic and urgency that Rachel could barely comprehend. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, the phone almost slipping from her grasp as she screamed into it, telling them her daughter had been shot and was bleeding out in the snow. The operator's voice was a distant sound, muffled by the overwhelming panic that consumed Rachel's every thought. All she could think of was Maya, lying there in her arms, barely clinging to life. The cold wind cut through the open door, but Rachel hardly noticed. She just focused on Maya's face, her pale skin, the blood that continued to pour, and the shallow, labored breaths that were growing weaker with each passing moment. When the ambulance finally arrived, Rachel was still holding Maya, unwilling to let go. The paramedics rushed in, taking Maya from her arms with swift efficiency. They worked frantically, hooking Maya up to and for, performing compressions, and trying to stabilize her as they loaded her onto a stretcher. But even as they rushed her into the ambulance, Rachel felt a sense of helplessness that crushed her. She couldn't stop the blood, couldn't reverse the trauma, couldn't protect her daughter from the terror she had just experienced. The ride to the hospital felt endless, every second more unbearable than the last as Rachel watched Maya's fragile body fight to hold on. In the sterile, bright emergency room, the doctors took over, working with precision but not offering any promises. Rachel was left alone in the cold waiting room, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. Clara had done this. Clara had shot her daughter, left her to die in the snow, and now Maya was fighting for her life in a hospital bed, all because of the cruelty of one woman. The weight of it hit Rachel like a ton of bricks, and as the hours dragged on, the emotional toll began to eat away at her. She felt powerless, as if all her strength had been drained in the fight to save her daughter. She should have been there, should have been able to stop Clara, should have done something to prevent this from happening. But all she had was the memory of her daughter's blood in the snow, the haunting image of Clara walking away without so much as a second glance. Maya's recovery was slow, a long, painful process. Every day she grew a little stronger physically, but the trauma of the attack lingered in her eyes, in her nightmares, in the way she flinched at every loud sound, every unexpected movement. The warmth that had once defined Maya, the laughter, the light in her eyes, had been dimmed, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Rachel could see it in her daughter's face, the way she struggled to move past what had happened. The emotional strain was something Maya couldn't just shake off. Despite Rachel's best efforts to comfort her, Maya couldn't escape the haunting memories. The bond they shared, though unbreakable, now carried the weight of the trauma they had both endured. It was a battle for Maya to heal, not just physically, but emotionally, and Rachel knew that the scars left by that snowy night would take years to fade, if they ever would. But Rachel vowed to stay by Maya's side, to help her heal from the inside out. She would never let her daughter feel alone in this, even as the emotional toll of the attack left its mark on both of them. The fight for justice was far from over, but for now, all Rachel could do was hold her daughter close, give her the strength she had left, and protect her from the world that had tried to break them. In the weeks following the attack, Rachel's grief began to evolve into something sharper, more focused. Her desperation for justice turned into a quiet determination, and with that determination came the realization that she needed to know everything about Clara Sullivan, everything that led to the unthinkable act of shooting her daughter. What had driven Clara to this point? Rachel had always known Clara to be a controlling, demanding figure, but she never could have imagined the darkness lying beneath the surface. Rachel began digging, reaching out to former neighbors, local records, anyone who might know more about Clara's history. What she discovered sent chills through her body. Clara wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was a woman who had used fear as a weapon for years. Rachel uncovered reports from her past, neighbors who had been intimidated into silence, a trail of complaints about her tyrannical behavior toward anyone who didn't comply with her strict and unreasonable demands. But the most disturbing revelation was about Clara's former tenants, who had once lived in the house she now occupied. They had been forced to move out after they spoke out about Clara's abusive tendencies, especially toward children. Rachel dug deeper, finding a pattern of manipulation and control. Clara had been using her position in the HOA to terrorize those around her, forcing them to live in fear under the guise of rules enforcement. Her obsession with order wasn't just about maintaining the neighborhood, it was about maintaining absolute control over the people she could dominate, and Maya, with her vulnerability, had become her latest target. But that was just the beginning. As Rachel gathered more information, she discovered that Clara's cruelty went beyond petty complaints. There had been instances, whispered rumors, and even reports of Clara physically confronting people she saw as a threat to her authority. What made this even more chilling was that Clara's manipulation didn't stop at her immediate victims, she had a pattern of isolating and intimidating those who had the potential to expose her. The realization hit Rachel hard. Clara had been planning this attack for months. She hadn't just snapped in a moment of anger, she had been waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Every interaction with Maya, every complaint, every subtle jab at Rachel was part of a larger plan, a plan that culminated in the night Maya had been shot. The more Rachel uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Clara had been pushing Rachel to the edge, testing her patience, trying to break her down. Her behavior toward Maya had escalated from subtle cruelty to outright threats. Rachel had brushed off the odd comments Clara made, the cold looks directed at Maya, never fully understanding the depths of the woman's malice. But now, as she connected the dots, Rachel saw the clear signs of an obsession: Clara's need to rid herself of anything she couldn't control, anything she saw as an obstacle to her authority. And Maya, with her disability and innocence, had become the perfect target. Clara had known that Maya couldn't defend herself in the way others could. She had known that Maya would be an easy victim, and the idea of her simply eliminating the problem had become a twisted solution in Clara's mind. The most shocking revelation came when a mysterious witness, a man who had once worked as a handyman for Clara, came forward with damning information. He had seen Clara, just days before the attack, preparing for the assault. He recalled seeing her loading something into the trunk of her car, something that looked like a large object wrapped in cloth. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when the shooting occurred, he remembered the odd exchange he'd overheard between Clara and a few of her HOA associates. According to him, Clara had spoken openly about eliminating the problem that was Maya Thompson. The witness had been too afraid to speak out earlier, knowing the kind of power Clara wielded, but with the attack now public, he finally felt compelled to come forward. Rachel's world tilted as she absorbed this new information. Clara had been preparing for this moment, planning it all along. Her cool, calculated demeanor during the HOA meetings, her subtle threats, everything had been a carefully orchestrated build-up to that fateful night. Clara's need for control had driven her to a point where she saw murder as the only way to eliminate what she perceived as a threat. And the worst part? She had used the HOA, her position, and her influence to set the stage for her attack, manipulating everyone around her into silence. The revelation shook Rachel to her core. Clara was no longer just a cruel neighbor, she was a predator, a woman who had used her power to cover up her violent tendencies and who had masterminded an attack that nearly cost Maya her life. But with this new information, Rachel had the ammunition she needed to expose Clara for who she truly was. The fight for justice wasn't just about seeking revenge, it was about exposing the monster that had hidden behind a mask of respectability and making sure Clara faced the consequences of her actions. The deeper Rachel dug, the more she realized that Clara had been hiding in plain sight for years, and it was time for her reign of terror to end. With every new detail uncovered, Rachel's resolve grew stronger. Clara would not get away with this. She would not be allowed to escape the consequences of the pain she had inflicted on her daughter and their family. And Rachel, armed with the truth, would make sure of it. Rachel's determination to seek justice for Maya quickly turned into a battle she never anticipated. The weight of the system was working against her at every turn. Authorities, initially hesitant to act, seemed reluctant to press charges. They cited a lack of concrete evidence, despite the horror of the shooting and Maya's severe injuries. The small town they lived in, once a tight-knit community, was now divided. People who had once smiled and waved at Rachel now looked at her with suspicion, questioning her version of events. Clara's influence within the HOA and the community was undeniable. She had spent years cultivating an image of herself as a well-respected, upstanding citizen. Her charm, combined with her position, allowed her to manipulate the situation. Clara's supporters, many of whom were people Rachel had known for years, began to cast doubt on her account of what had happened that night. The smear campaign began quietly at first, whispers in the streets, subtle insinuations in local papers, and comments from people who had once been Rachel's friends, now siding with Clara. They painted her as an emotional, grieving mother who was simply overreacting, someone who didn't fully understand the situation. But Rachel refused to be silenced. Every roadblock she faced only fueled her resolve. She knew the truth, and she wasn't about to let Clara escape unscathed. Rachel dug deeper, refusing to back down. She began to gather her own evidence, piecing together the story that Clara was desperately trying to keep hidden. The first breakthrough came when Rachel uncovered surveillance footage from a local store near the neighborhood, showing Clara near the scene on the night of the attack. The timestamp and footage clearly showed her arriving, walking toward Maya's house, and then, after the gunshot, leaving the scene. This footage was damning, but Rachel needed more to tie Clara to the crime. She knew Clara's actions weren't isolated, they were part of a larger scheme. Rachel began questioning neighbors, reaching out to people who might have witnessed Clara's behavior over the years. Slowly but surely, she uncovered more disturbing details about Clara's conduct in the neighborhood. People who had once been too afraid to speak out now started to share what they had witnessed. Clara had used her position in the HOA to manipulate those around her, making life miserable for anyone who didn't conform to her vision of how things should be. There were whispers of others who had been ostracized, punished, or even driven out of their homes by Clara's relentless pursuit of control. Rachel pieced together evidence of a conspiracy. Clara had been targeting anyone who didn't fit in, using her HOA position to create an environment of fear and silence. It became clear that the attack on Maya wasn't an isolated act of rage, it was a calculated, premeditated move by someone who saw herself as above the law. Rachel knew she couldn't do this alone. She hired a fierce lawyer named Evelyn, whose reputation for handling high-profile cases was well known. Evelyn immediately recognized the strength of their case and jumped into action. Together, they built a strategy, focusing on Clara's history of manipulation, the surveillance footage, and the new testimonies they had gathered. But Clara's legal team, a group of seasoned professionals, was not going to let her go down easily. They launched a full-on assault against Rachel, trying to discredit her at every turn. They painted Rachel as a grieving mother, someone so overcome with emotion that she was exaggerating the details of the attack. They questioned Maya's credibility, suggesting that the injury was an accident, that perhaps Maya had stumbled and fallen. They even tried to undermine the surveillance footage, claiming it was tampered with. It became clear that this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war of attrition. Clara's lawyers used every tactic to wear Rachel down, dragging the case out for months, forcing her to relive the horror of that night over and over again. But Rachel's resolve only grew stronger. Every piece of evidence she uncovered, every truth she exposed, made it more and more difficult for Clara's defense to hold water. As the case progressed, Rachel found herself fighting not just for her daughter's justice, but for the truth to be heard loud and clear. It wasn't just about a mother seeking revenge, it was about exposing the darkness that had been lurking in their community for years. Clara's reign of terror needed to end, and Rachel was the only one who could make it happen. The battle was far from over, but Rachel knew that with every fight, they were one step closer to taking Clara down. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the trial neared its peak. Rachel sat on the edge of her seat, her heart pounding, every muscle in her body taut with the weight of the moment. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the pressure of what was about to unfold. Maya was about to take the stand. Rachel had never imagined a moment like this would come, but here it was, her daughter, the victim of Clara's cruel attack, was about to speak the truth, to make the world listen. Maya, still fragile but stronger than she had been before, walked slowly to the witness stand, her eyes downcast but her resolve shining through. Rachel's breath caught as she watched her daughter take her seat, the very person who had been the target of such violence now poised to hold Clara accountable. Maya's testimony was quiet at first, her voice shaky, as though the words were too heavy to bear. But with every sentence she spoke, the truth became clearer, more undeniable. She described the night of the attack, the coldness of the snow, the sting of the gunshot, the fear that gripped her as Clara aimed at her. Maya spoke of how she had tried to escape, to crawl away, her disabled body failing her as she bled in the snow, helpless and vulnerable. Her words cut through the silence like a knife, each one carrying the weight of the trauma she had endured. The room was silent, save for Maya's voice, as she recounted the horrors Clara had inflicted on her. There was no room for doubt, there was no other explanation. Maya's testimony left the courtroom reeling, and for the first time, Clara's carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel. Clara sat across the room, her composure slipping, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. Her cold, calculated facade cracked, and her guilt was impossible to hide. The fear in her eyes was palpable. She knew, deep down, that her lies had been exposed. Every attempt she made to maintain control faltered as the weight of the truth settled over her. Clara had tried to present herself as the victim, as a woman simply upholding the rules, but now, with Maya's testimony, her true nature was on full display. Clara's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Rachel saw the woman she had feared for so long, the woman who had manipulated everyone around her, hiding behind a mask of civility and respectability. Rachel's lawyer, Evelyn, seized the opportunity. With a calm, unwavering voice, she presented the evidence that had been carefully gathered over the past months, the surveillance footage, the witness statements, and the damning reports of Clara's past behavior. The photos of Maya's injuries, the medical records, and the witness testimony about Clara's repeated threats against Maya all came into play, building a clear picture of premeditated malice. Evelyn methodically laid out how Clara had used her position of power in the HOA to manipulate and intimidate, how she had plotted the attack on Maya, and how the entire community had been unknowingly subjected to her cruel control. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Clara's coffin, and with each piece, Rachel felt the weight of the injustice lifting just a little more. Clara's defense team scrambled, trying to cast doubt, but their arguments were weak, unfounded, and ultimately irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Clara's past crimes, her manipulation of those around her, and her callous disregard for human life were now laid bare for everyone to see. The room, which had once been filled with doubt, now buzzed with a sense of certainty. Clara was guilty. The judge, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, finally spoke, his voice firm and commanding. "The evidence is clear. The testimony is undeniable. The actions of Clara Sullivan are reprehensible, and the court finds her guilty of attempted murder." The words hung in the air, and Rachel felt a surge of emotion rush through her. It wasn't just a victory for them, it was a victory for every person Clara had ever harmed, for every neighbor who had suffered in silence, for every injustice that had gone unpunished. But even as Clara's face contorted in disbelief, her eyes wild with panic, Rachel knew that this was just the beginning. Clara had lost everything. The truth had come to light, and there was no escaping the consequences now. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, and for a moment, Rachel felt like the world had stopped. Clara Sullivan, once a respected figure in their community, was found guilty of attempted murder and attempted manslaughter. The judge's voice was firm and resolute as he declared the sentence. Clara was to serve a lengthy prison term, with no chance of parole for a significant number of years. As the gavel came down, Rachel allowed herself a small sigh of relief. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of justice wash over her. Clara, the woman who had caused so much pain and fear, would finally face the consequences of her actions. Her reign of terror had ended, and Rachel knew that the streets they lived on, once governed by Clara's manipulative grip, would never be the same again. But as the weight of the verdict settled in, Rachel's thoughts turned to Maya. Her daughter, still recovering from the physical wounds of that horrific night, now had to begin the long, difficult journey of healing emotionally. The road ahead would not be easy. The trauma of what had happened to her, the terror of being targeted and left to die in the cold, would leave scars that no verdict could erase. Maya was strong, but Rachel knew that the scars would linger. The courtroom victory was one part of the battle, but Maya's recovery, her ability to reclaim her life after everything, was just beginning. Therapy sessions were now a part of their routine, and although Maya was starting to find moments of peace, the emotional toll was far from over. Rachel made it her mission to support her daughter every step of the way, knowing that with time, and her unwavering love, Maya would find a way to heal. But Rachel also knew that the road to emotional recovery was unpredictable. Each day was a small victory, each therapy session a step toward reclaiming the joy Maya had once radiated so effortlessly. In the community, Clara's reputation crumbled like a house of cards. The once untouchable figure in the HOA, who had ruled with an iron fist, was now exposed for who she truly was, a cruel, calculating woman willing to destroy anyone who didn't conform to her twisted ideals. The truth about her actions spread like wildfire, and the HOA's complicity in enabling her cruelty became impossible to ignore. Many in the neighborhood, who had once turned a blind eye to Clara's behavior, now found themselves grappling with the reality of the damage she had caused. The dynamics of the community shifted overnight. Neighbors who had once feared Clara's power now began to speak out, sharing stories of how she had bullied and manipulated them for years. People who had kept silent, too afraid to challenge her, now found the courage to stand up and demand change. The HOA, once a tool for Clara to control the neighborhood, was left in disarray, its authority shattered. For Rachel, it was a bittersweet moment. While Clara's influence over the neighborhood was finally broken, the damage that had been done to her family could never truly be undone. Maya, though still fragile, began to find small moments of peace. She was able to sit in her room without feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her, able to enjoy the quiet moments she had once taken for granted. Her therapy sessions, though painful, began to offer her a glimpse of hope. The anger and fear she had held inside slowly started to dissipate as she allowed herself to process what had happened to her. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the fear crept back in, but Rachel was there, offering her unconditional support. Maya was learning to live again, to reclaim the pieces of her life that had been stolen from her in that one cold, brutal night. With each passing day, Maya grew stronger, though the healing process would take time. Rachel knew the journey was long and the scars would remain, but she also knew that Maya was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, and that truth, above all else, gave Rachel the strength to keep moving forward. Together, they would rebuild their lives, piece by piece, knowing that no matter how long it took, they would find their way back to the light. As Rachel sat beside Maya, watching her daughter begin to regain her strength, she felt a wave of pride wash over her. They had been through hell, but they had made it through together, stronger than before. Clara's actions had stolen their peace, torn apart their sense of security, but what Clara couldn't take was their strength, their unbreakable bond, and their resolve to keep moving forward. Rachel gently squeezed Maya's hand, her voice thick with emotion as she whispered, "We survived. And we'll keep fighting, fighting for you, for me, and for every person who's ever been wronged." Maya, her face weary but filled with a quiet power, lifted her head and smiled, a small but significant sign of how far she had come. "We won't let them take anything else from us," she said, her voice steady and full of newfound strength. The weight of their journey, the pain, the struggles, the tears, none of it had broken them. It had only made them more resilient. This story wasn't just about surviving a tragedy, it was about reclaiming power, standing tall in the face of darkness, and the undying love between a mother and her daughter. As the screen faded to black, one thing was clear: the fight for justice doesn't end here.